Good morning. Glad to be here. My name is Murray, one of the pastors here at Grace Fellowship. On your left over here is Dean. He's going to be preaching at ASL for the deaf community, so thank you. And we thank you to the Central community and the other groups assisting them today for hosting this morning as well. I'm actually kind of surprised at how many of you came back after last week, because I kind of expected a lot of you would be still sitting on your couch, your hair kind of all matted up, Dorito crumbs over you, just mumbling, meaningless, what's it all mean, kind of in your best Eeyore imitation from Winnie the Pooh. Because we started Solomon's book, Ecclesiastes, last week, where the king of Israel, the richest, most powerful person in the world in his day, actually gave the conclusion to the meaning of life under the sun. Under the sun is a phrase he uses often in this book. And he said that literally everything is meaningless. It's the Hebrew word Hevel. We looked at that. Literally, that means smoke or vapor. And he uses it some 38 times in this small little book of 12 chapters. And so it becomes a key theme. It says that trying to grab hold of smoke, it's just empty. It's no lasting substance. It's unpredictable. Or the word in the ESV, that translation we're using this morning, is vanity. It's just vanity. You just can't have that. So all of our toil, he says, everything we go to under the sun to find deep meaning, ultimate satisfaction, significance, just gives us no lasting gain. So Solomon says, none of what I actually pursued with my life actually paid off in the long run. It just all ended up being like trying to grab hold of smoke, trying to grab hold of vapor. It just wasn't there. Now, if you missed the opening message from last Sunday, you can find it online, graceas.com. You'll want to catch that message because it really sets the tone. It gives the framework for everything else. Because that, he sets it all in chapter 1, and then every other chapter just sort of follows from that. Because really, it's chapter 1. He gives us the conclusion right up front. And he doesn't want us to just take his word for it. What he's going to do now in all the remaining chapters, he wants us to check his math. And so he's not going to just give us an answer. As a math teacher, right, I don't want to just see the answer. I want to see all the data, all the work. Show me how you reach that answer, right? That's what's important to me. And so this is what he's going to do. And so he starts off chapter 2 with how he devoted himself to maximize everything that feels good. He's going to maximize his pleasure and enjoyment in the world. So here's chapter 2. Let's check his math.
Reading from Ecclesiastes, chapter 2, verses 1 to 26. I said in my heart, "Come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself." But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, "It is mad," and of pleasure, "What use is it?" I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under the heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks, and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools, from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whenever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expected in doing it. And behold, all was vanity, and a striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, and there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes on his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceived that the same events happened to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For all is vanity and a striving after the wind. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who comes after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, yet he will be master of all, for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity, so I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is a vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. There is nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also, I saw, is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give it to one who pleases God. This is also a vanity and a striving after wind.
Okay, let's see if we can make some sense of that. So if you haven't yet found Ecclesiastes, basically go to the very middle of your Bible. That probably come up in the Psalm somewhere. Keep going to the right. You'll go past Proverbs and then Ecclesiastes, that little book that we're looking at here. So Blaise Pascal, also you might find it helpful. If you have a take-home sheet, there's an outline on the front page of your take-home sheet, and you might find that helpful because this is a lot we're going to go through, and we're going to move through it fairly quickly because it's a long chapter, and so there's a lot of things there. So you might find that outline helpful to you as well. Blaise Pascal, the great mathematician and physicist, he said this: "We all seek happiness. It's in every motive, even in the motive of those who hang themselves." And so there's this vacuum, there's this longing in the human soul, and we spend most of our waking hours trying to pursue levels of happiness, fulfillment, contentment. But Solomon, as you can see in this chapter, just basically throws a wet blanket on it all, right? And proclaims that all we look to under the sun, all the created stuff is inadequate. Because the infinite abyss in our soul can only be filled by something, by someone who is infinite, God himself, and nothing else can take his place. See, we were actually made for the happiness that actually comes by being in relationship to the joy-filled, glorious God who created us, or as in the book of Acts is, in whom we live and move and have our being. And in this chapter, Solomon then is going to try enjoying himself with every sort of pleasure at his disposal, which was pretty much anything, to test to see if he can fill that abyss. Can pleasure actually be the answer to the deep longing in his heart? Now, what do we know the answer is in our heads already? We know that the answer is no, but if you actually look at the way you live, you look at the way we live, I think it actually exposes that though we say no with our heads, maybe we actually believe it actually can. Maybe there's something in us that actually believes, no, I really think that can fulfill me. That can be my source of happiness. So let's look at his data. Let's check his math then to see if his conclusion is accurate, the one we agree with in our heads. Verse 1, he said, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. I think so far this chapter is so far so good, right? I in my heart can relate to that. I like to enjoy myself. Then he says, but behold, this also was vanity. And that's our word, Hevel, like trying to grab hold of smoke. So sort of like the prodigal son, he pursues pleasure with all his might. And he enjoys it. It was a great time, but it was just for a time, because in the end, he says it was Hevel, it was empty, it was chasing the wind, it was trying to grab hold of smoke or vapor. And smoke can look really neat. I know people take pictures, right, of smoke and different things, and they add lights in behind them. It looks so attractive, it's got that, but it isn't solid. It isn't lasting. It's not something you can actually take with you. You can't really keep it. Now, if I have to choose between pleasure and pain, I'm going to vote for pleasure, right? But let's see how Solomon pursued it. Verse 2, he said, I said of laughter, it's mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. There's the Eeyore voice again, right? So you got the first fountain of pleasure that he is going to drink from is laughter and drinking and partying. Laughter, he says in verse 2, or in verse 3, he calls it laying hold of folly, right? He's always then trying to joke, right? Let's make everything's got to be funny. Let's not take anything seriously. And we all love a good laugh. Because in fact, I think one of the most beautiful sounds in all the world is hearing a little toddler, a little one with a belly laugh, isn't it? It comes right from the rolls, right? And this belly laugh comes. It's got to be one of the greatest sounds in all the universe. But laughter, he says, that for a time was like medicine. It ended up just being a momentary distraction. Quoting all the funny movie lines provided him, a nice diversion, a brief escape, but it really gave him no ultimate healing or meaning. So laughter can be good, but it cannot save. It too needs a savior. In fact, if laughter could save, Robin Williams would still be alive. So Solomon, he left the comedy club, and then he heads across the street to the bar for a night of some drinking and then some clubbing, seeking pleasure in partying, drinking booze, getting high. Now, not to the point of being a total burnout, right? He doesn't want to end up in rehab. He doesn't want to end up in the gutter on the streets, right? He's not going to be an addict. He says his heart still guided him with wisdom in verse 3, right? So he was just going to, right? He just enjoyed the buzz, right? He could still function in life. But it was all about seeking happiness in the drinking with friends, in the partying, feeling whatever pleasure, intoxication could give him, hoping that substances could provide him some joy, some relief from really to cope and bring him some meaning in the life of stress under the sun. And Solomon, he threw some epic parties. You can read about Solomon's life. It's also in 1 Kings. So a lot of the information that I'm going to bring comes to you from 1 Kings, which you'll have to look up afterwards on your own. But he would go through 10 fatted oxen, 20 fatted cows, 100 sheep, plus deer and fowl, a lot of kegs and a lot of wine every night. Hundreds and hundreds of people, live bands. It was great for a while, he says. But he actually got tired of throwing epic parties, being everybody's buddy, waking up at noon. So then he decided he needed to make something of himself. So he moves on, secondly now, to houses and land. Verse 4, he says, I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made for myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees in his backyard. Human hands have made some incredible things, right? So Solomon now gives himself to creativity. And he's going to find meaning in the beauty and the things that he can now create. It actually took 7 years to build God's house, the temple. You know how long it took to build Solomon's own personal house? 13 years. That's how long it took that. So you can imagine the size of his own house. If you know anything about the size of the temple, you can imagine now the size of his own house and how elaborate it was, right? And what a yard. I mean, he had vineyards, gardens, and parks, plural, and a forest, right, with several pools. Amazing. The most amazing camping spot was in his backyard, right? He literally tried to recreate paradise. In fact, verse 5 says, and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees, is actually taken right out of the creation passage in Genesis regarding the Garden of Eden. So here he is, but man can't create paradise in this fallen world, especially when you try to play the role of God. Look at the language also in these verses, from verses 4 and 5. Notice it says, I made, I built, I planted, I made for myself. It's this God language from the Garden of Eden, from Genesis. This is living for himself with himself at the center of everything. And his soul is restless despite the initial satisfaction that it brought him, having this house and having land. It doesn't last. It isn't ultimately home. So he makes his house more and more elaborate, right, in order to finally achieve it, right? So that he can have a home that's this sweet escape, and it's a refuge for him from all the stressful and ugly things in life out there. And he didn't have anything in his house that came from IKEA or Walmart. And you can read in 1 Kings how his house had beams that came from Lebanon. Everything was designed with the finest craftsmanship. The hallways in his house were 50 feet wide. Just as hallways in this massive place. His dad's chair, his throne, right, was ivory covered with pure gold, set with rubies and sapphires and emeralds and other precious stones. He had these 12 life-size solid gold lions that lined 6 steps to get up to his dad's chair, right, that were lined. So he had these 12 lions on these 6 steps. And then he thought, you know what would be really cool to have in the backyard? Some peacocks and apes. Again, you see that in 1 Kings, right? They hung out by the back porch. This made Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch look like a shack in the slums. And then thirdly, he turns to seek pleasure in comforts. I mean, Solomon, he's over the top with his house, with his comforts, with his entertainment. Not only did he have his ultimate dream house, and he had this land where he could connect with nature, it says in verse 7, he had servants and slaves to look after it all, to do absolutely everything that he didn't like to do. In fact, he had, at different times in his life, he had between 10 and 30,000 at his beck and call. He says in verse 7, I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I'd also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. He was the envy of other nations. He was the envy of other kings. The Queen of Sheba comes and goes, the half of it wasn't told me. How many of you think, gosh, it'd be nice to have a maid clean up the house? Chef to cook up the meals, people to clean up afterwards, a landscaper to mow my grass, a stylist to put on my makeup, choose my clothes each day, course, that would be after my personal masseuse got all the kinks out. Well, Solomon had all that and more, but it didn't satisfy. He had a horse ranch. We're told also in 1 Kings, he had 1,400 unique chariots, right? That's the vehicle of the day. So it'd be like having 1,400 automobiles. He had horses, flocks, beyond anyone else in the world. And he had all these pets. He had animals that he had brought in from all around the world. And he had other people to do the scooping. And his conclusion? It's still Hevel. It didn't last. As nice as it was, it didn't ultimately satisfy the discontent in his soul. So fourthly, money and power. Verse 8. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. Right? He didn't have to stick to a budget. He couldn't spend enough. But money couldn't buy himself ultimate contentment and satisfaction and joy. In fact, stats today tell us that suicide rates and depression are highest among the rich, proving that an increase in money does not lead to increased happiness. And that's what Solomon is saying. He's saying it's good to have your needs met, right? Money and family are good, but if they're your primary source of life, they will leave you empty. Fifth, entertainment. The middle of verse 8, he says, I got singers, both men and women. I mean, what a playlist, not on vinyl, right? He just brought in the band live. It's like having a friend call you up and say, hey, we're having a few friends over tomorrow night. Love to have you join us. What's the plan? Hey, we're just having a small house party. Garth Brooks and his band will probably play a few songs. At least Bono said Garth would be here for a few more days yet. It'll be all in the living room because it's supposed to rain. And I think Drake's helping Jay-Z and Beyonce get it all decked out now. And, that's what it'd be like. And he would lose himself in the beauty of music. But the songs always end. And then the reality and stresses of life would still be there waiting for him. So number 6, sex. The end of verse 8. He says, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So he had the most beautiful women in the world. So he's got supermodels who are a feast to the eyes. He had full access to everything in the world that brings pleasure. Right? He had 700 wives at the same time. Wonder how often he heard, we never talk anymore. Don't get enough quality time. And then he had 300 beautiful women on speed dial just for sex. He didn't need internet porn because he had beautiful women willing to do whatever he wanted. Now, what's a guy with 700 wives need 300 girlfriends for? I don't know. It seems extreme. But I think some people today have a harem larger than Solomon's on their internet history. Think about that. And still aren't satisfied. Still aren't satisfied. So as powerful as sex is, it did not satisfy the longing of his soul. His seventh source of pleasure and happiness was popularity and fame. So you can see that in verse 9. Verse 9 tells us his greatness, his fame surpassed all others. He was popular, because that's what happens when you throw epic parties, right, and have everything that people want, right? I mean, rock stars, athletes, they probably lined up to get his autograph. Yet it brought no ultimate satisfaction, he says. Hevel. See, we think if I had all he had, if I had all they had, I'd be happy. But he wasn't. We need to think about that. And if you won't believe Solomon, consider Marilyn Monroe, Kurt Cobain, Robin Williams, Kate Spade. The list goes on and on. And then in case he didn't mention something that you think would bring ultimate happiness, To make life meaningful, he says this in verse 10, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. He had absolutely nothing on his bucket list. Nothing. He says, I had a lot of pleasure. I had a great time. I had great enjoyment in my life, but it didn't last. Ultimately, it was Hevel, he says in verse 11. So Ecclesiastes is not going to tell us that a non-Christian can't have a lot of pleasure and joy in their life. But living a self-centered life is not the way God designed it to be. And what joy and pleasure you do get won't last, he says. It just can't be permanently held on to. It's like trying to grab hold of vapor, smoke, Hevel. It was fleeting, elusive, and he says it had diminishing returns. So Solomon says, I had wine, women, and song. At first it was exciting, but I need more. I always need more. What once was exciting no longer brought about the same excitement, the same pleasure. See, once he had played out all his fantasies, he realized it was not the source of ongoing, meaningful, a joy-filled life that he anticipated. It was all Hevel, it all faded, it did not satisfy. Now, in our generation, the cry is really, do not repress your desires, because that's dangerous. If you suppress your desires, that'll lead to depression, maybe even suicide. No matter what your desire is regarding gender identity, sexual orientation, pleasure, whatever your dreams, do not repress. Don't repress any of your desires. But God lovingly tells us through Solomon that indulging your desires for self-fulfillment, to find your identity, is what is dangerous and leads to depression. Pleasure is not bad, but it cannot be ultimate. Pleasure is a good thing that, if turned into a God thing, becomes an enslaving thing that destroys you. So if foolish hedonism doesn't work, maybe living the right kind of life will, right? Well, Solomon goes on to verse 12 to 17 to establish trying to find a meaningful, joy-filled life is not even found in wisdom and living a restricted, righteous, moral life. In fact, if you look at Solomon, he's really second in all the history of the world to Jesus as far as having wisdom, IQ, knowledge. I mean, he'd win every Jeopardy. And he says wisdom and education provides some benefits, he says. Right? It's helpful to you. He says that in verse 13, right? But then he goes on to say, but they're only temporary benefits. The wise person dies no better off than the fool. Both end up as worm food. No matter how high you ascend in life, you'll end up 6 feet under. Well, maybe our memory and the good that we did in the world can live on. Nope, Solomon says, verse 16, both you and your achievements will be forgotten. And then in verses 18 to 23, he says, trying to find a meaningful, joy-filled life, it's not found in leaving a great legacy. It's not about leaving a great legacy, he says, because that's just like plowing water. Right? You look back at all you've accomplished, it's Hevel. It won't last. And then in all his busyness, he says this in verse 24, he actually ended up missing out on so many of the simple joys that God actually provided for him. So in verses 24 and 26, he now turns to God and tells us that contentment in God and his gifts is the meaningful life under the sun. Which sounds a lot like Paul when he wrote to Timothy, right? What we looked at, right? Godliness with contentment is great gain. Before this, there's no mention of God. But now when God actually comes into the picture, when he's at the center, everything changes, right? That which was meaningless actually now becomes a gift to enjoy. Even the pain and frustration, the Hevel, actually becomes a gift that can lead us to God. So, we've given the rush through the chapter. Now let's see what can we conclude from what we've read and looked at. I think, first of all, we can conclude this, that God did make us. We're created. We're creatures of desire. We have desires. We're people who have hunger and thirst. But everything under the sun will satisfy our hungers and thirsts only for a time. It's short-lived. In other words, there's nothing that's going to satisfy you for any lengthy period of time. And we desire a lot of things that God has actually created us with these desires. We desire comfort and security. We desire an identity to know, who am I, right? We desire beauty and love, not just to behold it either, but to be in it. We can eat and drink and sleep and make love because we were made for this world and we were made for God. Both and. So when you live in the world, though, apart from God, then it gets confusing. It's broken. It's devastating, and it's ultimately meaningless, he says. Desire is good. Jesus said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's having our desires ultimately really being sought in drinking from the right fountain. See, that's what God says too in Isaiah chapter 55. He says, how long are you going to buy bread that doesn't satisfy you? And then basically he's going to say, how long are you going to drink wine that makes you more thirsty? How long are you going to just continue to do the same things over and over again in hopes that finally you're going to find some fulfillment? He says, you're not going to. And then he gives the invitation, the same invitation that echoes out to the woman at the well and says, come and buy from me. Right? Without money, without price, come and eat my bread. Come and drink my wine. Come and sit at my table and partake of the richest fare. Come and be filled at no cost to you, but we know at great cost to Jesus. See, the problem is not that we have desires. The problem is that sin started when human beings took their deepest desires, their deepest hunger, and then went to things under the sun to satisfy. See, our first parents in the garden were made to enjoy God, right? To have their ultimate identity and comfort and security and meaning in Him, a relationship with this God. And then they were given all kinds of good gifts, like food and work and relationships and sex and family. But then in a tragic moment, you can read in Genesis chapter 3, just 3 chapters in the Bible, they exchanged really the worship and fulfillment and relationship of the Creator for that which is found in the creation. And this sin made us blind and cold and hard to the satisfaction beyond the sun. C.S. Lewis, he actually wrote this, that the idea that, our desires are God-given. They're good. But he says the trouble is in our sin, our desires are actually too weak. We're far too easily pleased. We're far too easily satisfied. We're satisfied to make mud pies in the back alley when we're being offered a wonderful vacation at the seashore. When we fix our hearts on the temporary, it can't sustain us. That great theologian Mick Jagger, he preached this to us for decades. Right? I can't get no satisfaction, right? And here's the problem, because things under the sun did not create you. Things under the sun cannot forgive you. Things under the sun cannot name you. Things under the sun cannot ultimately heal you nor ultimately love you. The infinite abyss in our soul can't be satisfied by finite things. We need the beauty of the God who is beyond the sun. Now, what if, imagine this for a while, what if the God over the sun, took on human flesh and entered into the Hevel of human existence under the sun, and then took that Hevel into himself, even to the point of death on a cross, so that we could actually live a life of meaning and security and love and joy with the eternal Father. That would be good news. That is the good news message of the gospel, right? And that's number 2 thing we can conclude from this, is that Jesus came from beyond the sun to be the answer to our deepest desire. See, Jesus got life without God on the cross so that we can have life with God, even here under the sun. Jesus inserted himself into our misery, into our mortality, into our guilt and despair for us. Now that's love. Jesus is the bread of life that satisfies in a way that regular bread under the sun cannot. In John chapter 7, Jesus stood up in the middle of this great celebratory feast, and he says, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink." Jesus came to be living water that quenches our ultimate thirst forever. He came to be the wine of the new covenant that gladdens the heart deeper and more fully than any other wine can. And believe me, Solomon didn't drink his wine out of boxes. He had the best of everything there was. But Jesus did create you. He can forgive you. He can name you. He can give you an identity that fulfills. He can heal you. And his love is superior and it lasts forever. And his beauty and joy knows no end. See, Jesus has come to bring us back into union with God, the infinite one of infinite love and joy and pleasure. Verse 26, look there. It uses a phrase twice. And what's the description that he uses there? You see, to the one who pleases God. Do you see that? The trouble is, there's only one who pleases God, the Bible tells us. There's only one person in all of history then who can actually gather and collect and be given all the lasting and satisfying things from the hand of God. And that's Jesus. All others are sinners who displease God. So how is it we could find favor with God? How can we please him? It's through the gospel, right? As we repent, surrender, trust in Jesus for our full acceptance with God, for our righteousness. That which brings us then into union with God, with Jesus, the one in whom the Father says his soul delights, of whom he said this is my beloved Son, in whom my soul is well pleased. And then we are granted that same standing as children in him. And then God says of us, this is my beloved child, in whom I'm well pleased. Amazing. And we see then that the questions of Ecclesiastes can only be answered by a future revelation of God that we have in Jesus. In Jesus, all the false hopes are completely smashed. And my illusions of self-sufficiency, they're found sadly lacking. But Jesus gives me the true and better story. Walking with Jesus is not about a dull, gray, boring existence. It's drinking deeply from the fountain of delight who is God himself. It's turning from all the things that can't fulfill my deepest longing and desire to the only one who can. And then lastly, I think we can conclude this. When ultimate desire is answered, then the things under the sun are again good gifts. See, most people worship the gifts, right? So that sex and money and pleasure itself become gods. But that's trying to find life by addition. I'm trying to add something more to finally get that satisfaction. But then the other end of the pendulum is to try to live by subtraction, right? Where we can run, we're going to avoid, we're going to abstain from the gifts just so that they don't control us, right? Because if it's enjoyable, it's probably a sin. Is it? In other words, you got to suppress all your desires because you're not holy unless you're miserable. Because then you don't enjoy sex with your spouse, right? Or money or food or wine. And then the rules will get crazy. You don't go to a restaurant that serves alcohol, or don't listen to music that has a beat, right? Here's what's crazy about Jesus is when our loves get rightly ordered, it's actually wonderful. And then we love God foremost, and we view created things as good gifts from Him to be used as He purposed and as He has designed them for our good and His glory. God says, if you use the gifts in relationship with me, I'll show you how it's supposed to go. And I will show you how to enjoy it. I'll show you how to be happy. When you try to control or use His gifts to find your ultimate satisfaction, though, then it becomes Hevel. But when you enjoy the gifts as worship unto God, they become little tastes of heaven and a little anticipation of what all will be. When things under the sun are seen and received as gifts and not God's, they actually lead us to God Himself, praising and worshiping and just thanking Him for His goodness and grace to us. Gifts to be enjoyed rightly as just part of our worship of God, the one who created me, who loves me, and despite my own sin and folly, who gave His life for me. When God is ultimate, see, then I can go to the playground with my grandkids, and it's not a waste of time, right? It's not me thinking, well, I could be accomplishing all these other things and doing all this, right? But God is with us, and it's a real blessing then just to enjoy that moment as a gift from His heart and His hand. If you're single and you think a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a spouse is going to name you and satisfy you and be your comfort and provide meaning in your life and complete you, that's actually going to rob you of the joy you could have under the sun. What you're doing is you're loading so much weight on that person, whether they're real or imaginary at this point in time, there's no way you could actually ever have a meaningful relationship with them. But when Jesus names you, when He's your source of comfort and identity, when He's your ultimate spouse and joy, that actually frees you to receive a spouse if God grants you one, but as a gift to love as one who's been loved by God. If you're a parent and you're putting all that weight on your kids as the ones who give you identity, in whom you find your joy and delight, meaning in life and your future, they won't be able to stand under the pressure. And you'll be too busy trying to control everything. But when Jesus is your meaning and when Jesus is your future, it takes the pressure off. So you can actually enjoy your children as a gift from God. In marriage, to have sex be the thing that satisfies you, then you're setting yourself up for sex to be a god that will destroy you and crush your spouse. But when Jesus is your Lord, then you can receive it as a gift. And you can lay it down at times when you need be to love your spouse. See, Jesus comes to rescue and redeem and reorder all our loves. To love God preeminently frees us to love people. It frees us to not worship stuff, but to receive things as gifts where we can enjoy without being addicted, because that's just not the main thing to us. See, since that day in the garden in chapter 3 of Genesis, we always have thought we just need that one more tree. We just need that one more kind of fruit that God hasn't already provided. See, Solomon's life in so many ways just reminds me of the prodigal son in Luke 15. So many think that the prodigal son's sin was partying too much. And then he came to his senses and he just left all his party days behind. But the story doesn't just start with a party. it ends with a party. See, there's a kind of partying under the sun in the far country that leaves the son broken, but there's also an epic party thrown by the father. When he gets back home and there is dancing and there is singing to be heard from outside. The difference is the son back then in the far country, just like the elder brother at home, they can't enjoy the party rightly until he's satisfied and in awe of the Father's love and grace to them. And then he can come into the Father's party, enjoying the gifts with the Father in his presence as it was meant to be. That's the gospel of Jesus. Being satisfied in Jesus and his love and grace, we now can enjoy life, marriage, children, work, laughter, gardening, building, and so many other pursuits as God intended, all being enjoyed with God and for his glory. So ultimate and lasting joy is a gift that God gives to those reconciled to him. And that satisfaction comes by being and not simply by having. It's about who we are in relationship with God, not about what we have in an effort to replace God. Because only God makes life meaningful.